For Crema Media's Polity, I'm JanAd Stemmet. Joining me today is Riaan de Villiers to discuss the book he co-authored with JanAd Stemmet titled Prisoner 913, The Release of Nelson Mandela. So, Riaan, give our viewers a little insight into what this book is about and tell us about your journey with the co-author of this book, Riaan.
The book deals with a really fascinating resource, in our political archive. As we know, in the last years of his imprisonment, Nelson Mandela started interacting with the government. He wrote about that process in Long Walk to Freedom, but still today it's sort of been shrouded in secrecy, and also his account was not completely candid, I have to say. So what happened was that the Minister of Justice and Prisons at that time was Kobie Coetzee, and he played a major role in talking to Mandela, as we know. Now, in his ministry, Kobie kept files on Mandela, which is understandable, it's almost normal, but there were two unusual things about his archive. The one is it was absolutely massive. He became obsessed with Mandela, and the file is absolutely enormous. Secondly, what he did that nobody knew was that he got the prison service to record Mandela's conversations in secret with all his visitors, well, with some of his visitors, and nobody knew about that. Clearly, they used that to inform their view of Mandela and to use it for political purposes. So what happened was that nobody, Kobie Coetzee, when he left his ministry, took those files home with him, which was sort of, I suppose, illegal at the time, but, a lot of funny things happened. In the year 2000, JanAd Stemmet, who is a historian, went to Kobie Coetzee to interview him about the transition. Kobie then says to him, I have incredible material I want to give you, which was clearly this archive. Now, 2 days later, JanAd Stemmet switched on his TV and he saw that Kobie had died of a heart attack, to his shock. And of course, he felt that, the idea of this archive drifted out of his mind. Now, 13 years later, no less, JanAd was contacted by this archive at the University of the Free State. And they said to him, look, we've got this incredible, this new material, come and have a look at it. When he looked at it, he realized that he had found the Coetzee archive, because in the interim, Coetzee's widow had donated all this huge amount of material to the archive, but I didn't know about it. He then started studying the archive, and in collaboration with another academic, Willie Esterhuis at Stellenbosch, they started working on it, but Willie eventually did write a book about it that didn't get much attention. I was brought in at a later stage to help reshape or shape the book. And so I wasn't involved right from the beginning, but I became very involved towards the end. So that's more or less my response up to there. And of course, what the archive does give us now, all this time, is after all this time, is it provides us with a fresh insight into those events behind the scenes. What happened was that both, as we know, Mandela wrote about it in Long Walk to Freedom, which I think many people also still to this day misunderstand what he said about it. Secondly, F.W. de Klerk also wrote in his own autobiography, Long Walk, The Last Trek, A New Beginning. He also wrote about his meetings with Mandela, but both of them swept a lot of stuff under the carpet, which they decided not to tell us. And we now know what those things were. Or some of them in any case.
And Nelson Mandela is known to have the famous prison number 46664. What is the story behind the 913 now?
Well, that I think is very interesting. As you know, later on, the 46664 became globally known because it was a sort of an international campaign. Now, 46664 was his number on Robben Island. It means he was prisoner number 64 that arrived in the year, whatever it was, 1964. And he got a new, what people don't know is he got a new number at Poulsmoor and a new number at Victor Verster. But there was another hidden number in the prison system, a permanent number to have for long-term prisoners. They get another number to do with the parole system. That number was 913. So the fascinating thing is that all the Coetzee files and all the government correspondence. They never refer to the 46664. They refer to prisoner 913. So it's quite eerie, but that's the meaning of that number.
Now I get it. And in the beginning of the book, Riaan, you talk about Mandela and de Klerk's account of events, like you've just told us, being highly selective to the point of being misleading. How so?
Right. Well, you know, that is, I think it's a very good question. Now, what Mandela, for instance, does in Long Walk to Freedom, which became famous, you know, he says very openly, and I think this is still misunderstood by many people, he says while he was in Victor Verster, he had a change of heart. Not Victor Verster, Polsmoor prison. He decided that the armed struggle wasn't going to get anywhere. And he decided that the only way forward for South Africa was to start negotiating. And he then approached the government and he said, I want to talk to you guys. And I want to facilitate discussions between you and the ANC. And he also says very frankly in Long Walk to Freedom that, you know, many people were opposed to this. You know, his fellow political prisoners, and he communicated secretly with Oliver Tambo in Lusaka, and Tambo was very suspicious. But, you know, the amazing thing is Mandela then said, I decided that sometimes leaders have to lead, and I'm going to strike out in this new direction. And in a funny way, history proved him right, you know. Now, then the debate started about, I must maybe just comment on that, you know, people then accused, as we know, inside the movement, inside the mass democratic movement and inside the ANC, Mandela was widely accused of being a sellout because he had started talking to the government. But, you know, the point is just that I think that is a sterile argument to pursue today. The point is he said that already in Long Walk to Freedom, you know, and from then on, by definition, if one still believed in the armed struggle, he was a sellout by definition, you know. So the point is that at the same time, as we know, that he was talking to the government, people like Thabo and Mbeki on a completely different track had also begun talks. You know, and the whole international context changed. And also, you know, the Cold War dissipated and all the, you know, all these forces were saying to both the National Party government and the ANC, guys, this must end. You know, you've got to sit down and sort this thing out. But now, what happened was, to then come back to your question, is I do think, though, that what this record shows us is that Mandela was a bit closer. He was working more closely with the National Party government than perhaps his colleagues would have liked to hear. You know, he was very friendly with these guys. He made all sorts of proposals, as we know. He you know, after meeting with F.W. de Klerk, he tried to get a deal together between the ANC in Lusaka and the National Party government. And that initiative, in which Ramaphosa, among others, was involved, so our current president, interestingly enough, that deal, you know, that thread just peters out, partly because I think at that point, the ANC in Lusaka didn't quite know what he was up to, you know, and that they sort of kept him at arm's length. So, so I think Long Walk to Freedom is very selective. I mean, just to give one example, you know, he talks about talking to Gumi Coetzee and all these guys, but then he talks about meeting F.W. de Klerk on the 13th of December 1989, which is just 3 months before his release. Then in Long Walk, he jumps straight from that point to de Klerk's speech in Parliament on the 2nd of February. Now, as this book shows us, a huge amount happened in between. You know, he de Klerk, you know, de Klerk made proposals to him, and he asked Mandela to convey them to Lusaka. They gave him permission to phone Lusaka, and he spoke to Alfred Nzo and Thabo Mbeki on the telephone several times. And then, you know, the archive isn't always complete. As I say, the thread then peters out, and we don't quite know why. But you know, I think it's slightly disingenuous after all these years, I have to say, for the grand old man of politics, you know, to have you know, chosen to tell us some things and not to tell us other things. If that makes sense to you.
And Riaan, it must have been a daunting task to go through the archives. Tell us about that exercise and how you were able to verify the information that was at your disposal.
Well, you know, the one lucky thing is that we, in a way, we don't have to verify it. It is so obviously true, you know. When you take one look at this material, you know you're looking at the original, secret memorandums. You know you are looking at original transcripts of conversations. And that's the wonderful about it. It conjures up the past in an extraordinary way. You know, you feel as if you're there. You really are transported back in time. So the one lucky thing is there's no room to say this stuff is not authentic. You know, it clearly is. That's the wonderful thing about it. Now, the other thing is that the archive is, first of all, it's massive. You know, just the Mandela file, which was just one file in the Kobukutsi archive. There were similar files, which many people still don't know about Walter Sisulu and the other prisoners and a whole bunch of other things. Now, the Mandela file is 13,000 pages. And they were put in all sorts of different categories in Coetzee's office. But over the years, some of those things became misplaced. And also, so the archive, to cut a long story, is very difficult to decipher. It took us hours and hours and hours and hours to figure these things out. Sometimes they are handwritten documents and they were photocopied, so they're illegible. Some things lost their covers, some things are in the wrong places, and so on. So it was really a bit of a detective story.
But I get you if you say you felt like you were in some of these meetings and discussions while you were going through the files. And in chapter 3, you talk about a strategy for releasing Mandela and other security prisoners. Can you tell us about that top secret memorandum that was written and signed by Gopi Coetzee?
In chapter 3, are you talking about the State Security Council meeting? Yes, no, that's a remarkable thing. I mean, Gopi Coetzee, as we say in the introduction, later on there was a remarkable, as you may know, an Irish researcher and son of a chap called Padraig O'Malley, who came to South Africa, and he interviewed many of the key role players in the whole transition, and he compiled a very, very valuable archive of interviews. Now, he interviewed Gopi Coetzee 4 times, and Gopi said to him that since the late 70s, he had realized that Mandela had to be released and the political situation had to be normalized. Now, the interesting thing is that we found proof of this in the archive, because what happened is, as we know, in the early years, the National Party said to Mandela, we'll release you, but we're going to release you. You can only go to the Transkei, you know, which was then run by his cousin, Kaiser Matanzima. And of course, if he had done that, it would have meant that he had tacitly accepted the whole apartheid system. So Mandela said, no, I refuse to accept that. If you release me in the Transkei, I'm going to walk right back to Joburg. That's what he always said to them. I'm going to walk back and resume my activities in MK, you know. It's not acceptable. So the big shift then was in January 1985, P.W. Botha, because of course by then the National Party government was under enormous international pressure. But he stood up in Parliament and he said, I will release Nelson Mandela provided he renounces violence. And this also went for other political prisoners. And Mandela then refused, of course, because, he said, I can't, he stuck as a matter of principle. He stuck to the principle of armed struggle. But the big shift is that what P.W. Botha meant was that they had given up the idea that they would release Mandela to the Transkei and that they would release him to so-called white South Africa. In other words, he could go back to Soweto. He could do anything as long as he renounced the... Now, Mandela refused, but what our documents show is that before that, in the last month, in December and January, there were meetings of the State Security Council, which we know was a very, very important instrument in the time of the P.W. Botha government. And what the documents show us, very interesting, is that Gopi Coetzee wrote a memorandum to the State Security Council in which he advocated Mandela's unconditional release, no conditions whatsoever. And then P.W. Botha decided, no, he's going to add that condition that Mandela has to renounce violence in public. And Mandela then refused, and his refusal, as we know, was read out by Zinzi Mandela in Soweto at that rally, this famous statement called My Father Says, which is quite moving. But to make the point again, what we found. So we found proof of the fact that even at that stage, Kubi Kutsi was advocating Mandela's unconditional release 4 years before it happened.
That's remarkable. And it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
interesting to also read that a group called the Imminent Peasants group that was led by a Nigerian politician, General Olusegun Obasanjo. I was also shocked that he was also involved in these kinds of talks. It also involved former British cabinet minister, Lord Barber, who they visited Mandela.
Yeah.
Can you briefly share
Yeah.
what transpired during their visit?
Well, I think it is fascinating. I mean, we know it's a matter of history that the EPG came to South Africa, and it's important because the reason why they came is because the Commonwealth was exerting increasing pressure on the South African government. They were saying, guys, if you don't end apartheid now and release Mandela, we're going to impose sanctions on you, serious sanctions. The person who was still trying to prevent that was none other than Margaret Thatcher. But what they then did, I think it was at the Bahamas, a meeting in the Bahamas, the Commonwealth accepted the resolution. They were going to send the EPG to South Africa to do an assessment of what was going on, what the room was for reform and so on. So they came, and we know that, it's on record. It ended very badly because they were still meeting around and so on, and what then suddenly happened is P.W. Botha ordered the military to go and bomb MK installations in neighboring states. And this was such a shock. They left, I think, the same day they flew out of the country. But the important thing that we did not know about the EPG is what they were really doing here is not only talking to role players to say what is happening and reporting back. They were in fact trying, they had suggested a solution. I think this was less clear at the time. And they discussed this with Mandela in that meeting. Very interesting. And what's so interesting then is that Mandela already is very pragmatic. He says to them, guys, if you can go and talk to the government about this, your ideas. And if you can persuade them, I'm in. I support you. And in broad outline, it was a framework for the preconditions to negotiate a settlement. So all the things eventually pointed in the same direction. But it was still, he was at that point already. What it shows you at a relatively early stage, Mandela was very pragmatic, very flexible, and he was saying to these guys, I'm not only going to cling to the ANC policy. If you can persuade the government to adopt your model for a negotiated settlement, I'm in, which is really, really interesting.
And for interest's sake, if someone was to ask you that going through these archives, did they give you a different understanding of how Mandela or who Mandela was?
Well, it certainly does. This is a really good question, I must tell you. What this project has forced me to do is to deepen my understanding of Mandela. There was so much happening in the 80s and the 90s, as you know. There was all the violence, there was political contestation, we all got punch drunk, people died in their thousands. It was a very, very grueling time. Mandela came out of jail and things happened so fast, I think from then on, that many of us, it's as if we never really caught up with what happened. We never stood still and assessed what was happening. And the funny thing is, I think to this day, many South Africans are still, in a way, struggling with the past. Not that they oppose the transition to democracy, but it happened so fast that they really haven't come to terms with it. I see this everywhere. So it forced me personally, to read Long Walk to Freedom much more carefully. It forced me to figure out, when did Mandela decide, to start talking to the government, and why? And what happened afterwards, and why was he really released? I mean, the one thing, and this is not a criticism of him, but I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. People somehow believe because Mandela spoke to the government, he was released and the transition was set in motion. But I think this is actually incorrect. There was a huge shift from the time of P.W. Botha to the time of F.W. de Klerk. And F.W. de Klerk, although he spoke to Mandela, he was as a matter of principle, on 2 February, he set the transition in motion. you know, and Mandela was just, although very prominent, he was another political prisoner. It's not because he spoke to Mandela, because he decided to do it in any case, you know. So what it does, but as I say, I don't intend that to, you know, we have to realize ultimately, we have to recognize the depth of Mandela's vision, you know, and to go back to Long Walk to Freedom, never mind what we said in this archive. You know, where in 2 paragraphs, he sets out his decision to start talking to the government, essentially that the armed struggle was a dead end. And that he would then start working for a negotiated settlement. And the amazing thing is, whatever suspicions the ANC and the National Democratic Movement had, you know, he came out of prison. He, you know, after being in jail for almost a third of a century, you know, very quickly he had to readapt, he had to reimpose his authority, which is an extraordinary achievement, you know, which we must never take away from him. And the simple fact is that his vision in the end triumphed. There was, not only because of him, but there was a negotiated settlement, which we still obviously trying to you know, refine today. But the one thing I would add to this is that, you know, I think, for instance, some of our political parties are skating at the edge of this. You know, what this book and rethinking about Mandela, you know, what this, you know, in a way we have to, it helps us to rediscover the roots of our current dispensation and to think through why it has come about and how it came about, which I think is very relevant today.
And lastly, Riaan, what do you hope readers will take away from this book?
Well, firstly, I would hope that readers will take away just the pleasure of history for its own sake, you know, not necessarily for a purpose. I still find it fascinating to look at the sorts of things we discovered, you know, the conversations Mandela had and so on. You know, I think they are quite remarkable and very revealing on a number of levels. But secondly, I think for me, the value of the book, hopefully, would be exactly that, is that it helps us to clear away misconceptions of what happened. Because this is a remarkable thing, even from the reviews of our book, I've begun to realize how many people still misunderstand what happened. And I think it can only help us to gain clarity about the roots of our constitutional settlement, the interim constitution, the final constitution, our multi-party democracy, in order to examine again where it was born and how it was born.
That was Riaan de Villiers in conversation with Polity about the book titled Prisoner 913, The Release of Nelson Mandela.